It's Sunday, May 30th. And most of you know that I was not a fan of Donald Trump. And this topic that I'm going to talk about today is one example of why I had problems with the president. This is an example of something that he did when trying to do something very good for people. It involves the suspension of payroll taxes for federal employees making less than $104,000 a year. So in August of 2020, he wrote an executive order that exempted those people from paying payroll taxes until the end of 2020. And for some reason, in whatever communications were sent to these people, they believed that in 2021, when it was time to pay taxes, which is what this executive order dealt with, they would have to come up and pay their taxes in 2021. But for some reason, 1.3 million people didn't understand that. And now there is a giant hullabaloo because the Department of Internal Revenue has notified these people that they have to pay up these back taxes by the end of this year. Now, when Trump did this executive order, he bypassed Congress. Trump set up the policy on August 8th, 2020, in a memo to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, directing Mnuchin to defer some payroll taxes to put money directly in the pockets of American workers who needed it most. Now, I don't consider people making $104,000 people who need it most. Now, there may have been a lot of people who are only making $30,000 or $40,000 at the lower echelons of government service. So it's not clear why the cutoff was $104,000. That's not clear to me. But anyhow, Trump sidestepped Congress to make the change because the pandemic was of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant an emergency declaration. And nobody could argue with that. I would not argue with that. And I don't think there are many people that would argue that it wasn't severe enough to make this change. However, I would expect that there would have been some guidance somewhere along the line. These people who got this deferment were not really notified. They did not understand that after the pandemic was over at some period in time, they would have to fork up this money that they had given up in 2020. Now, many of them probably would have said, I don't want to do that. I don't need this tax exemption in 2020. I don't want to pay it back in 2020 or 2020, whatever, because I don't need the money. I can afford to give it up right now. But if I thought that I didn't have to pay it back, then of course I'm going to take it. And that's not the case. So now these people owe 6.2% of 4 months' worth of salary, which for a person earning $104,000 a year is over $2,000. And if you make it $50,000 a year, it's around $1,000 that you have to pay. And for a lot of people, $1,000 or $2,000 is a significant amount of money to have to come up with. There are many former administration staffers who call this bill unacceptable. It's a very unfortunate situation and is very unfair because we didn't understand the parameters that we were getting this tax under. Because many of us would have said we don't need this voluntary repayment agreement, so to speak. Now, in the letter that was sent out to all these staffers, they were offered the option to pay by credit or debit card. And of course, that didn't sit very well with a lot of them. And it didn't sit well with them very well because they didn't have an option to opt out. They had to pay these taxes, which was not their understanding of the original agreement. And so you see, that's one of the problems that I had with President Trump. He tried to do many good things, but I don't think he ever thought about the unintended consequences of a lot of his actions. He is very quick to do things. And I can give you several examples jumping out of the nuclear deal without much thought. Because when you left that deal, you could have made some statements as to why you were leaving and what you thought you wanted in order to stay in that deal, to warn these people that we were not happy with the rockets and the missiles that Iran was creating. You could have done something like that. Jumped out of the climate accord, and we opened the Keystone Pipeline. And I don't have a problem with doing all those things. I have a problem with the lack of research and the fact that he alone made those decisions without conferring with any experts on the subject. And that was, I think, one of his major problems in his whole presidency. He was a one-man show, and he didn't depend on anybody else, and therefore he never got any decent advice that he would follow anyhow. But getting back to this situation, on August 28th, 8 days after the president wrote his emergency order, the Treasury Department released a notice. And this notice specifically stated that taxes were only deferred until January 1st, 2021. At which time repayment procedures were set to begin. The notice specifically indicates that employers who choose to defer the payroll taxes will have an obligation to repay these deferrals by April 20th, 2021, or be subject to penalties and interest. Then there was a follow-up notice that dealt with employee wages. And this notice said that the payroll taxes would be repaid from employee wages between January 1st, 2021 and April 30th, 2021. But this action was extended by the Consolidated Appropriations Act until December 31st, 2021. So we have 1.3 million employees who have to pay whatever taxes that were deferred last year. They have to pay it this year. A bunch of unintended consequences, a bunch of not paying attention, not notifying people, and that's the way his entire presidency ran. So this is an unfortunate incident for 1.3 million people. And luckily for him, he didn't defer the taxes for anybody except federal employees. Could you imagine if 150 million working Americans thought they had their taxes deferred and then found out that they had to pay them? Think about that. 150 million workers having to pay their taxes. It would have been a fucking disaster for the Republican Party. This is a bad enough disaster for them. But if it was 150 million people, that would be a real disaster. So in any event, that's what I have to say this morning, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.